Power doesn't always wear a crown. Sometimes it wears a suit. It doesn't command armies. It commands capital. It doesn't write laws. It decides which industries live and which ones die. In the early 20th century, one man rose to a level of influence so absolute that the United States government, the most powerful nation on earth, found itself dependent on him during its hour of greatest need. His name was John Pierpont Morgan, and for a brief, extraordinary moment, he held the fate of the American economy in his hands. This is not a story of conspiracy. It is a story of systems, ambition, and the raw mechanics of power. It is the story of the man who became so powerful that the government feared what would happen if he ever fell. Morgan was born into privilege, but privilege alone did not build his empire. The son of international banker Junius Spencer Morgan, he was raised inside the world of high finance and trained to understand markets from an early age. Yet, inheritance can open doors. It cannot command authority once inside. Morgan earned that authority through discipline, precision, and an almost intimidating financial intellect. After the Civil War, America surged into an age of explosive industrial growth, and nowhere was the expansion more chaotic than in the railroad industry. Companies overbuilt, slashed prices to destroy competitors, borrowed recklessly, and collapsed with alarming frequency. Investors panicked, markets trembled. Morgan stepped into the disorder not as a builder but as a reorganizer. He began acquiring stakes in failing railroads and imposing strict financial control. Waste was cut. Debt was restructured. Rival lines were forced into cooperation rather than ruinous competition. The strategy became known as Morganization. By the turn of the century, Morgan controlled roughly 1/6 of America's rail mileage, an extraordinary level of influence over the infrastructure that carried the nation's goods, people, and wealth. Then he turned to steel. In 1901, Morgan orchestrated one of the most audacious deals in financial history, merging Andrew Carnegie's steel empire with his own interests to form U.S. Steel, the world's first billion-dollar corporation. It was more than a merger. It was a declaration that American industry had entered a new era, the age of colossal corporate power. To supporters, Morgan was the stabilizer of a volatile economy, a man who brought order to markets prone to collapse. To critics, he appeared to be constructing a private empire whose reach rivaled that of government itself. By the early 1900s, J.P. Morgan was no longer simply a banker. He was a force, one whose decisions could move markets, shape industries, and influence the direction of the American economy. October 1907. The American economy stood on the edge of panic. The United States had no central bank, no Federal Reserve, no reliable mechanism to stop a financial contagion once fear took hold. The banking system was fragmented and fragile, thousands of institutions bound together largely by confidence, and confidence was beginning to collapse. It started with a failed attempt to corner the copper market. Speculators believed they could drive prices higher and control supply. Instead, the scheme unraveled. Banks connected to the speculation suddenly looked vulnerable. Depositors rushed to withdraw their money. Lines formed outside trust companies as rumors spread through New York. Panic moves quickly, and once it begins, it feeds itself. The stock market plunged, credit tightened, loans were called in, businesses struggled to breathe. America's financial engine was slowing. In Washington, options were limited. President Theodore Roosevelt, the trust buster who had challenged corporate power, was hunting in Louisiana as the crisis escalated. The Treasury attempted to steady the system, but its resources were not enough to calm the growing fear. There was no emergency backstop. no institution designed to contain the storm. For the first time, many realized how vulnerable the modern economy truly was. Banks hesitated to support one another. Markets trembled. Rumors multiplied. The system was beginning to fracture, and when institutions falter, power does not vanish. It concentrates. Across the financial world, attention turned toward one man, a banker whose influence was so great that even his rivals trusted his judgment in a crisis. The same man Roosevelt had once tried to restrain was now the country's best hope for stability. J.P. Morgan. Inside his private library on Madison Avenue, J.P. Morgan took command. The building itself felt less like a residence and more like a fortress of finance. Thick stone walls, towering shelves of leather-bound volumes, and an atmosphere heavy with consequence. Outside, panic rippled through the streets of New York. Inside, the future of the American economy was about to be negotiated. Morgan moved quickly. He summoned the presidents of New York's most powerful banks and trust companies, insisting they come at once. There was no time for hesitation. When they arrived, the urgency of the moment was unmistakable. The doors were closed, and according to many accounts, they were not opened again until decisions had been made. Hour after hour, deep into the night, the men argued over numbers that seemed almost unreal. Millions in emergency funds needed to prop up collapsing institutions and restore confidence before markets opened again. Morgan listened, calculated, and then imposed order. He demanded commitments, not promises, money, real liquidity, placed immediately into the system to stop the chain reaction of failures. Some resisted. The risk was enormous. No banker wanted to be dragged down by another firm's collapse. Morgan did not accept reluctance. Drawing on both his reputation and sheer force of personality, he pressured the holdouts, reminding them that hesitation could trigger a catastrophe none of them would escape. Then he escalated the signal. Morgan pledged his own fortune. It was more than capital. It was a message. If he was willing to stake his personal wealth, others would have to follow. But the crisis was still evolving. When the Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Railroad Company teetered toward failure, threatening yet another shock to an already fragile market, Morgan engineered a dramatic solution. He arranged for U.S. Steel to acquire the company, a move designed to stabilize confidence before panic could spread further. The deal carried enormous political risk and required the approval of President Theodore Roosevelt, whose administration had built its reputation fighting corporate consolidation. Yet the danger of inaction was greater. Permission was granted. The rescue moved forward. At one critical moment, Morgan delivered a stark warning to the bankers gathered around him. The fate of the country rested on their willingness to act. It was not rhetoric. It was arithmetic. If confidence returned, the system might survive. If it didn't, the collapse could spread nationwide. One by one, the commitments came, and slowly, the panic began to loosen its grip. Banks stabilized, credit started to flow again, markets found their footing. The immediate disaster had been avoided, but the image left behind was impossible to ignore. In its most vulnerable hour, the United States government had effectively depended on a private financier to coordinate the rescue of the national economy. No election, no congressional vote, no formal mandate, just one man, in a locked library, organizing the defense of the financial system. Theodore Roosevelt later acknowledged the necessity of Morgan's intervention. In the face of cascading bank failures, decisive action had been required, and Morgan had provided it. But the episode left a deep unease within America's political leadership. Because the crisis had revealed something impossible to ignore, private power had not only stabilized the nation, it had become essential to its survival. To many lawmakers, that realization was profoundly unsettling. If one financier could mobilize more immediate economic force than the federal government during a national emergency, what did that say about the balance of power in modern America? Reformers were quick to sound the alarm. Progressive politicians and investigative journalists, the famed muckrakers, began targeting what they called the money trust, a tightly connected network of bankers believed to exert enormous influence over credit, industry, and investment. Public suspicion grew, editorials sharpened, demands for oversight intensified. Soon, Congress authorized a formal investigation. The Pujo Committee hearings sought to determine whether a small circle of financial leaders, with Morgan at its center, effectively controlled the flow of American capital. Yet the deeper fear was not Morgan the individual, it was what he represented. A financial system so concentrated that, in a moment of panic, the stability of the entire economy could hinge on the judgment of a single private citizen. The conclusion for many policymakers was unavoidable. The nation needed a structure stronger than personality, stronger than private alliances, stronger than emergency rescues behind closed doors. It needed a system. The response was structural reform. The shock of the panic of 1907 led directly to the creation of the National Monetary Commission, tasked with redesigning the foundation of American banking. Years of study followed, drawing lessons from European central banks and the failures exposed by the crisis. Then, in 1913, transformation arrived. With the passage of the Federal Reserve Act, the United States established a central bank, an institution designed to provide liquidity, stabilize markets, and act as a lender of last resort when panic threatened the economy. It was, in many ways, a quiet admission. America had built the Federal Reserve largely to ensure that it would never again have to depend on another J.P. Morgan. J.P. Morgan died in 1913, just months before the Federal Reserve opened its doors. The very institution designed to prevent the nation from ever again depending so heavily on the authority of a single financier. He left behind an art collection worth tens of millions, a banking house that still bears his name, and a legacy as formidable as it was complicated. To some, Morgan was the indispensable man, the stabilizing force who stepped forward when America was at its most vulnerable and imposed order on a system drifting toward collapse. To others, he stood as the ultimate symbol of Gilded Age excess, a reminder that when private power grows too concentrated, it can rival the influence of democratic government itself. The debate Morgan helped ignite never truly faded. It simply adapted to a changing world. Today, its echoes can be heard in the rise of massive asset managers, dominant technology firms, and the expanding reach of global finance. The scale may be larger, the systems more complex, but the underlying question remains strikingly familiar. When does private influence become too great for any government to ignore? Power, in the end, is rarely absolute. J.P. Morgan showed how far one man could rise through capital, intellect, and sheer force of will. But history also revealed the limits of such power and the backlash it inevitably invites. The government did not destroy Morgan. It built institutions to ensure that no private citizen would ever again be quite so necessary or quite so feared. But more than a century later, the question feels surprisingly modern. Do figures like Morgan still exist? Has the system truly restrained private influence or simply transformed it? When markets move, industries shift, and fortunes shape the direction of economies, who really holds the power? The man who became so powerful that even the government feared him, ultimately helped create the system designed to prevent another like him. Yet the tension between wealth and authority never vanished. That contest, is still unfolding. Subscribe to our channel